I'll never forget the night I babysat for the Bakers. It's not something you just forget, you know? The kind of thing that sticks with you, haunts you. I don't think I'll ever step into their house again. It still sends shivers down my spine thinking about it. I didn't even see it coming. Honestly, they seemed so normal at first. But that night, let me start from the beginning. The Bakers, an ordinary couple. Well, that's what I thought. Lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside of town. Big house, well-kept yard, white picket fence. You get the picture. They had one little boy, Tommy, about 6 years old. I'd babysat for them a few times before, and nothing had ever felt off. Mrs. Baker was always so sweet, smiling and asking me about school, offering snacks before they left. Mr. Baker was more reserved, but polite enough. They were like one of those families you see in commercials, the kind where everyone's perfect, maybe too perfect. But who doesn't like an easy gig, right? That night, they asked if I could stay later than usual. They were attending some fancy dinner party downtown, wouldn't be back until after midnight. No big deal, I thought. I'd put Tommy to bed around 8, and after that, I'd have a few hours to myself. Watch TV, scroll through my phone. Easy money. Everything started off just fine. Tommy was a sweet kid. We played some board games, and he insisted on showing me his new Lego set. Typical babysitting stuff. He went to bed without much fuss, falling asleep almost as soon as I read him a bedtime story. I remember looking at him all bundled up in his dinosaur pajamas and thinking how peaceful everything felt. After that, I settled down on the couch. The Bakers had a huge flat-screen TV, so I figured I'd take advantage of it, maybe watch some Netflix. The house was quiet. Too quiet, actually. You ever get that feeling where the silence is so thick it makes you uneasy? I shook it off, telling myself I was being silly. But that's when things started to get weird. About an hour in, as I was halfway through some random rom-com, I heard a noise. A faint thud from somewhere deep in the house. I paused the movie, listening closely. Maybe Tommy had fallen out of bed or something. But no, it didn't sound like it came from upstairs. It was lower, like from the basement. I hadn't even realized the house had a basement. Curiosity got the better of me, or maybe it was just the need to make sure everything was okay. I grabbed my phone for a bit of light and ventured towards the basement door, which was tucked behind the kitchen. I'd never noticed it before. It was small, plain, almost hidden away. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a set of narrow stairs leading down into darkness. At first, I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, like I shouldn't be going down there. But then again, I was in charge of the house for the night, right? I had to make sure nothing was out of place. So I descended the stairs, one step at a time, feeling the cold air hit my skin as I went further down. The basement was strange. Not what I expected at all. It wasn't cluttered with old boxes or holiday decorations like most basements. Instead, it was surprisingly clean, almost sterile. The walls were bare concrete, the floor too. And there was this faint, almost mechanical hum in the air, though I couldn't quite figure out where it was coming from. But the oddest thing? In the far corner, there was a door I'd never seen before, metal, with a heavy-looking lock. Something about it made my skin crawl. Why would anyone need a locked door in their own basement? I stood there for a moment, just staring at it, trying to convince myself to turn around and go back upstairs. But then I heard it again. The same thud, only louder this time, coming from behind that metal door. My heart was racing. Every instinct was telling me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong. What if Tommy was down there? What if the noise was coming from him somehow? Maybe he had wandered down, gotten stuck behind the door. I couldn't just ignore it. I looked around for something to open the door with, and found a small set of keys hanging on the wall nearby. They looked old, rusty even, but one of them fit the lock perfectly. With a heavy clunk, the door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, and what I saw, I still have trouble talking about it. There were cameras, dozens of them, set up on tripods and mounted on the walls, all pointed at various parts of the house. The living room, the kitchen, even Tommy's bedroom. Every corner of the house was being watched, recorded, and then in the center of the room there was a table scattered with papers and photos. Hundreds of photos. I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I picked up one of the photos. It was me, sitting on the couch watching TV. I hadn't even been in the house 2 hours, and there was already a photo of me. But that wasn't the worst part. The other photos, they were of other people. Other babysitters, I assumed, all in different parts of the house, all completely unaware they were being watched. My heart was in my throat. I felt sick, dizzy, like the room was spinning. What the hell was this? Why were the Bakers recording people in their own home? And those photos, there were so many of them. Some looked old, like they had been taken years ago. Had they done this to every babysitter they hired? And then, I saw it. In the back of the room, against the wall, was a large cabinet. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe I was hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But when I did, I wished I hadn't. Inside were rows of videotapes, each labeled with a date and a name. I recognized some of the names. Girls from my school, friends who had babysat for the Bakers before. My own name was there too, dated for that night. The tape was still recording. I was frozen for a moment, my mind racing with what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I grab Tommy and get out of there? But before I could make a decision, I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving towards the basement door. I panicked. I turned off the light, closed the metal door behind me, and crouched in the corner, hoping whoever was upstairs wouldn't notice I'd been down there. The footsteps got louder, descending the stairs. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they would hear it. And then the basement door opened. It was Mr. Baker. He stood at the top of the stairs for what felt like an eternity, looking down into the darkness. I could just make out his silhouette from the faint light coming from the kitchen behind him. He didn't say anything, just stood there listening. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my phone steady. Finally, after what felt like hours, he turned around and walked back upstairs. I didn't wait for him to come back. As soon as I was sure the coast was clear, I ran. I grabbed Tommy, threw him over my shoulder, and bolted out the front door. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath, my legs burning. I called the police as soon as I could catch my breath. They showed up about 10 minutes later, but by the time they got to the house, the Bakers were gone. Vanished. They left behind everything, cameras, photos, tapes, like they had been planning it all along. I never saw the Bakers again. The police never found them either. The house was searched, but whatever the Bakers were up to, they covered their tracks well. Tommy was put into protective custody, and I've never babysat again. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder how long they had been watching me, watching all of us. And I can't help but think, what would have happened if I hadn't found that room? What if I'd stayed on the couch, oblivious to everything going on beneath my feet? I try not to think about it too much. But some nights, when I'm alone in my apartment and the silence feels too heavy, I swear I can still hear that faint, mechanical hum, like the sound of a camera whirring in the dark. I thought it was over, That getting out of the house with Tommy, calling the police, and never seeing the Bakers again meant I was safe. But I couldn't shake this feeling, this gnawing sense that something was still wrong. It started small, just unease at first. Every time I passed a reflective surface, it felt like I was being watched. I convinced myself it was all in my head, just the trauma of that night replaying over and over again. But then strange things started happening. Little things, barely noticeable at first, like my phone ringing once in the middle of the night, then stopping. Texts from unknown numbers, no words, just photos of random places, parks, grocery stores, busy streets, none of them familiar. But the feeling grew stronger. I couldn't sleep. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the faintest sound. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows felt off. And then one night, as I lay there in the dark, I heard it again, the same faint, mechanical hum I had heard in the baker's basement. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But it was unmistakable, the same low, persistent sound of a camera, whirring. I scrambled to my feet, fumbling for the light switch, and my room flooded with light. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the sound, still there, faint but present, like it was coming from the walls. Then I remembered the tapes. Those rows and rows of tapes in the baker's basement, each labeled with dates, each with names. How long had they been watching me? How many tapes were filled with images of me, of my friends, of people I didn't even know? And then it hit me. What if? What if it wasn't just the bakers? What if they weren't just watching in their own house? What if there were cameras everywhere? Frantic, I started tearing my room apart, searching every corner, every nook for something, anything that could be making that sound. I ripped open drawers, yanked the curtains off the rods, flipped over my mattress. The sound was getting louder now, echoing in my head, filling the room until it felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I saw it. In the far corner of my bedroom, tucked just behind a small vent, there was a tiny, almost invisible lens, no bigger than a button. My breath caught in my throat. How long had it been there? Who had put it there? My hands were shaking as I reached for it, pulling it out of the vent. The camera was wireless, sleek, the kind you'd never notice unless you knew exactly what to look for. I wanted to scream, to throw it across the room, but I couldn't. I couldn't think straight. My mind was spinning, a million questions flooding my brain all at once. Who was watching me? Was it the bakers? Was it someone else? And how many more were there? My first instinct was to run. But where? Where could I go where they wouldn't find me? I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911, but before I could hit call, a message flashed on the screen. I froze. The message was simple, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. They knew. They had been watching me the whole time, even after I left the baker's house. But the worst part, the message wasn't from an unknown number. It was from my own phone. My phone, the one I had with me the entire time, was being used against me. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The bakers weren't just a creepy couple with a secret basement. They were part of something bigger, something much more sinister. They weren't the only ones recording people. They were part of a network, a web of surveillance, controlling lives without anyone knowing. Panicked, I grabbed my backpack and shoved whatever I could find into it. Clothes, my wallet, my charger. I had to leave, had to disappear before they came for me. But as I swung the door open, ready to bolt out of the house, I froze. Standing there in the doorway was Mrs. Baker. She was smiling, that same sweet smile she always had when she greeted me at the door. But this time, it wasn't warm or welcoming. It was cold, calculated. "Going somewhere?" she asked, her voice unnervingly calm. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. What do you want?" I stammered, feeling the walls closing in around me. She stepped inside, her eyes never leaving mine. "Oh, honey," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You've been such a good girl, but you know too much now, and we can't have that, can we?" I could feel the blood drain from my face as I backed up into the room, my mind racing for a way out. The camera in my hand, the photos, the tapes, it all flashed before my eyes. "You're part of this network?" I could barely get the words out. She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh dear, it's much bigger than a simple network. We've been watching you your whole life. Not just in our home, but everywhere. School, the mall, even here, in your own bedroom." She stepped closer, her eyes glinting with something dark. "You belong to us now, and there's nowhere you can run that we can't follow." That's when I saw him, Mr. Baker, standing just behind her, silent, watching. And then it hit me, the full weight of the realization. This wasn't just about surveillance. They were grooming me. Grooming all of us. "You'll understand soon enough," Mrs. Baker continued, her voice sickly sweet. "But for now, you need to come with us. We have plans for you." I shook my head, my mind screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something. But before I could react, I felt a sharp sting at the back of my neck, and everything went blurry. I stumbled, my vision fading. The last thing I saw was Mrs. Baker's face, inches from mine, whispering, "Don't worry, sweetie, it'll all be over soon." When I woke up, I wasn't in my room. I wasn't even in the house. I was strapped to a chair in a room I didn't recognize, dimly lit, cold. The sound of that same mechanical hum filled the air. And then I realized I wasn't the only one there. All around me, other people, other girls, were strapped to chairs, just like me. Their eyes wide with fear, their faces pale as they stared at the cameras mounted on every wall. We were all being watched, recorded, just like before. Only this time, there was no escape. And as I sat there helpless, the door creaked open and the Bakers walked in, their smiles still perfectly in place. "You're part of the family now," Mrs. Baker whispered, "and we'll be watching forever." The terror that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever known. Every part of me screamed to get up, to fight back, but I couldn't move. The restraints were too tight, digging into my wrists and ankles, biting into my skin with every slightest attempt to struggle. The other girls, the ones I'd seen slumped in the chairs beside me, didn't even try anymore. Their eyes were glazed, lifeless, like they had already given up. But I hadn't. Not yet. I tried to focus, to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me. The Bakers had revealed their true selves now, and it was worse than anything I could have imagined. They weren't just watching us, they were collecting us. For what? I still didn't know. But the sick satisfaction in Mrs. Baker's eyes, the cold detachment of Mr. Baker as he methodically adjusted the cameras, made it clear that whatever they had planned for us wasn't going to end well. "I know what you're thinking," Mrs. Baker said, her voice cutting through the thick silence in the room. She stood directly in front of me now, so close I could feel her breath on my face. "You think you can still get out of this? You think someone's coming to save you?" She leaned in, her smile twisting into something cruel. "But they're not." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I believed her. Who would come? Who would even know where to look? The police had searched the Baker's house and found nothing. They were smart, so much smarter than I had realized. Every move they made had been calculated, precise, leaving no loose ends. Except me. I had escaped once before. And I had to believe I could do it again. As Mrs. Baker circled the room, addressing the other girls in that same sickly sweet tone, I let my eyes roam, searching for anything that could help me. The room was stark, almost empty except for the chairs and cameras. But then I noticed something. Across the room there was a small panel on the wall, slightly ajar. Wires spilled out of it, leading to the cameras, and I realized it was some kind of control box. Maybe if I could get to it, I could disrupt whatever they were doing. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. My heart raced as I carefully flexed my wrists, testing the restraints again. The leather was worn in some places, frayed at the edges. Maybe, just maybe, I could work my hand free. I had to try. While Mrs. Baker's back was turned, I started slowly twisting my wrist, biting my lip to keep from crying out as the rough edges of the strap scraped against my skin. Blood trickled down my arm, but I kept going, knowing that pain was the least of my worries. As I struggled, Mrs. Baker continued to speak, pacing in front of the cameras as if she were putting on a performance. "You see, we're not monsters," she said, her voice dripping with false empathy. "We simply offer a service. People think they want privacy, but deep down, they crave control. They want to know that someone is watching, guiding their lives, even if they don't realize it." She paused, looking directly into one of the cameras with a knowing smile. "Our clients pay good money to watch, to see every moment. And you, my dear," she said, turning her gaze back to me, "are just the newest addition to our little collection." My stomach churned. This wasn't just some sick voyeuristic game. They were broadcasting us, selling access to our lives like we were nothing more than entertainment. But I wasn't going to let them win. Just as Mrs. Baker began walking toward me again, I felt the strap around my wrist loosen. My hand slipped free, and I quietly, moved to undo the buckle around my other wrist, keeping my movements slow to avoid drawing attention. "Sweetie," she cooed, bending down in front of me again. "There's no use resisting, you're ours now." But as she leaned in, I struck. My now free hand shot forward, grabbing her wrist and twisting it sharply. She gasped in pain, stumbling backward. Without thinking, I yanked my other arm free and bolted out of the chair. Chaos erupted. Mr. Baker lunged for me, but I was faster, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I ran straight for the control panel on the wall, slamming into it and ripping out the wires, one by one. The cameras around the room flickered, and a sudden, eerie silence fell as the mechanical hum died. The other girls who had been staring blankly ahead now seemed to stir, blinking as if waking from a trance. But I didn't have time to focus on them. I had to get out. Mr. Baker was already recovering from his failed grab, and I could hear Mrs. Baker's furious footsteps behind me. I sprinted toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. It wouldn't budge. "No," Mrs. Baker screamed, her voice filled with fury now, all pretense of sweetness gone. She was on me in seconds, her fingers clawing at my arm, trying to drag me back. But I kicked out, catching her in the stomach, and she crumpled with a wheeze. I didn't stop. I threw myself against the door with all my strength, and finally it gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. But I couldn't stop running. I tore down the dark, narrow corridor, my footsteps echoing off the walls, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I could hear Mr. Baker shouting orders, the sound of feet pounding against the floor as he chased after me. As I ran, I realized I didn't know where I was. This place, it wasn't the Baker's house. It was something else, something larger, more industrial. Cold concrete walls stretched out in every direction, dimly lit by flickering lights. But I didn't care. I just had to keep moving, had to find an exit. I rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. There, at the end of the hallway, was a large metal door. The exit. I could see the faint glow of moonlight leaking in from the cracks around the frame. Freedom. But just as I took a step forward, I felt it. A sharp sting in my neck, the same sensation as before. My legs gave out beneath me, and I crumpled to the floor, my vision swimming. I struggled to stay conscious, to fight off the darkness that was quickly closing in around me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Mr. Baker standing over me, a syringe in his hand and that cold, emotionless expression on his face. "Did you really think you could escape?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We always finish what we start." When I woke up, I was back in the chair, the same room, the same cameras. Only this time, the restraints were tighter, more secure. There would be no escape. And this time, the cameras were all pointed at me. Mrs. Baker stood in front of me, her smile back in place, but now it was a different kind of smile. Not sweet, not kind, but triumphant. "Don't worry, darling," she said softly. "You're safe with us now, and this time, you'll be the star of the show." And as the cameras whirred back to life, I realized the horrifying truth. I wasn't just being watched anymore. Now I was the entertainment, and there was no way out. Moving to a new city for school was supposed to be exciting. Fresh start, new people, and independence. I had spent hours scrolling through Craigslist, searching for something affordable that wouldn't feel like I was living in a closet. That's when I found it. A house shared with two other girls, both students, like me. It wasn't perfect, but the rent was cheap, and it was only a few blocks from campus. When I met Emma and Nicole, they seemed nice enough. Emma was always studying, and Nicole worked late, but I figured we'd get along just fine. At first, things were normal. We shared the space, didn't see much of each other, but there were no problems. Just the typical routine of a student juggling classes, study groups, and part-time jobs. But then things started to change, and the house didn't feel so normal anymore. The house was old, with creaky floors and thin walls. You could hear everything, footsteps from upstairs, voices from the neighbors, house, the wind whistling through the gaps in the window frames. At night, when the house settled, it felt like the walls were shifting around you. I got used to the sounds after a while. But sometimes, especially late at night when I was alone, I'd hear things that didn't make sense. Like the sound of footsteps when no one was home, or muffled voices from somewhere in the house when both of my roommates were out. At first, I brushed it off. I figured it was just the quirks of an old house, or maybe I was just hearing the neighbors. I didn't want to seem paranoid, and I didn't want to admit that the house made me uneasy. So I ignored it. But then things started going missing. Small things. My phone charger, a book I had left on the coffee table, a pair of shoes. At first, I thought maybe my roommates had borrowed them, but when I asked, they both swore they hadn't touched my stuff. I didn't push it. I mean, they were nice girls, and it wasn't worth making a fuss. Still, the feeling of unease grew, like there was something just off about the place. It was a Friday night, and I had just finished a long shift at work. Emma was out with her boyfriend, and Nicole was working late, as usual. I was exhausted, but the house felt unusually quiet, like the air was heavier than usual. I remember feeling this strange tension, like something was hanging over me, pressing down. I told myself it was just because I was tired. After making myself a quick dinner, I decided to take a shower before heading to bed. The bathroom was small, with a single window that barely let in any light. The mirror was fogged over as soon as I turned on the hot water, and I could feel the warmth seeping into my skin, easing the exhaustion from my muscles. As I stood under the water, I let my mind wander. For the first time all day, I felt like I could finally relax. But then, there it was, a sound. Distant at first, barely audible over the running water, but it made my heart skip a beat. Thud. I froze, standing perfectly still, listening intently. At first I thought it was nothing. Maybe it was just the house settling again. But then it came again, louder this time. Thud. It was coming from outside the bathroom. Someone was banging on the door. My immediate thought was that it was one of my roommates. Maybe Emma had come back early or Nicole had gotten off work early, but something about the sound didn't feel right. It wasn't the casual knock of someone trying to get your attention. It was forceful, demanding. I turned off the water, my heart pounding in my chest. "Just a second," I called, trying to sound casual, though my voice cracked. No response, just another loud thud. My stomach twisted into knots. Something was wrong. I grabbed the towel and wrapped it around myself, wiping the steam from the mirror with my hand. The reflection staring back at me looked pale, wide-eyed, like I was seeing a ghost. I tried to shake off the creeping sense of dread. It had to be one of my roommates. Maybe they were in a rush or something. I opened the bathroom door, but there was no one there. The hallway was dark, the air cold and still. The only sound was the dripping of water from my hair hitting the floor. I stepped out slowly, looking around, but the house was silent. Too silent. My skin prickled with unease. I could feel something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. That's when I saw it. The front door was slightly ajar, just enough for someone to slip in or out without making a sound. My heart stopped. We always kept the door locked. Always. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat, but before I could react, I heard a creak from behind me. I spun around, and that's when I saw them. Two men, tall, dressed in dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by shadows, standing at the far end of the hallway. My mind couldn't process it at first. It felt surreal, like a scene from a movie, except this wasn't a movie. This was happening. Right now. I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could make a sound, one of them rushed toward me. He grabbed me by the arm, and I fought back, thrashing and kicking with everything I had. My towel slipped, but I didn't care. I clawed at his face, his arms, anything I could reach. But he was strong, too strong. He pinned me against the wall, his hand clamping over my mouth, silencing me. I tried to bite down on his hand, but my vision was already starting to blur, my head spinning from the shock and the fear. The other man was searching through the house, opening doors, rifling through drawers. I didn't know what they were looking for, but I knew that if I didn't get away, it wouldn't end well for me. As my strength started to fade, I heard something. Footsteps running up the stairs, fast, heavy, and then the sound of a door slamming open. I barely had time to register it before the second man was yanked away from me. It was Nicole. She had come home early and found them. Without thinking, she threw herself at the guy holding me, shouting at him, clawing at his face. The man staggered back, startled by her sudden attack. It was enough of a distraction for me to shove the other man away and scramble to my feet. My head was spinning and my legs felt weak, but the adrenaline kept me moving. "Get out!" Nicole screamed, still trying to fight them off. "Get out of our house!" The men looked at each other, realizing they had lost the element of surprise. With one final shove, they bolted for the door. They were gone as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Nicole and me standing there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. For a moment, everything was still. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My skin felt cold, my muscles weak. Nicole was breathing heavily, her hands shaking as she reached out to steady me. They were in the house, I whispered, still in shock. "How did they get in?" Nicole shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know. We immediately called the police, and within minutes, the house was swarming with officers, asking questions, taking statements, searching for any signs of forced entry. But they didn't find anything. No broken windows, no damaged locks. The front door had been left open, but none of us could remember leaving it that way. The police said it was probably a random break-in, but something about the way those men had moved, the way they had searched the house, it didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, like they knew what they were looking for. But what? We didn't have anything valuable. We were just students, living in a cheap rental house. The rest of that night is a blur. The police stayed for hours, but by the time they left, it was nearly morning. I remember sitting in the living room with Nicole, both of us too scared to sleep. Emma came home early the next day, shocked to find out what had happened. She kept apologizing, like she somehow felt responsible for not being there. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that those men weren't just burglars looking for a quick score. I kept thinking about how they had searched the house, how deliberate they had been. I even started wondering if they had been watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then one day, as I was packing up to move out, the fear was too much and I couldn't stay there anymore. I found it. Hidden in the back of a drawer in the kitchen, buried under old receipts and takeout menus, was a key. A key that didn't belong to any of us. I held it in my hand, staring at it, my heart racing. How long had it been there? And what door did it unlock? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood there, frozen, holding that small, cold key in my hand. The weight of it felt so much heavier now. Someone had access to our house, and it wasn't a stranger. This wasn't random. It was someone who knew us, or at least knew our home. I immediately ran through a list of possibilities in my mind: former tenants, maintenance workers, maybe even the landlord. But deep down, I knew that the most chilling possibility was one I hadn't wanted to consider. Someone inside the house. Someone I trusted. I couldn't confront Emma or Nicole right away. What if I was wrong? But what if I wasn't? My mind kept replaying the night of the break-in. How deliberate those men had been. How they hadn't seemed surprised by the layout of the house. It was as if they knew exactly where to go. It didn't make sense for random burglars to be that calculated. For days, I kept my distance, watching them closely, looking for anything that might give me answers. But everything seemed normal. Emma continued her routine of studying late at the library, and Nicole was always rushing off to her job at the restaurant. They were both as shaken as I was by the break-in, or at least they seemed to be. But the doubt wouldn't leave my mind. One evening, I made an excuse to stay home alone. I told Emma and Nicole I was meeting some friends for dinner, but instead I hid in my room, waiting for them to leave. Once I heard the front door close, I began my search. I knew it was risky, but I had to know the truth. I started with Nicole's room. It felt invasive, rifling through her things, but I didn't know what else to do. I went through her drawers, her closet, but found nothing unusual. Then I checked Emma's room. It was tidy, meticulously organized, which only made me feel more guilty for being there. But again, nothing. I was about to give up when something caught my eye, a small black notebook tucked between some textbooks on her desk. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers trembling slightly. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, mostly school-related. But then I flipped to the back and saw something that made my blood run cold. There were names, several names. Most of them I didn't recognize, but two of them were familiar, mine and Nicole's. My heart raced as I read through the list, my mind spinning. Why were our names there? Why were we part of whatever this was? I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach as I began to piece things together. This wasn't just a notebook for school. It was something else, something sinister. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I had to confront her. The fear that had been gnawing at me since the night of the break-in was now mixed with anger and confusion. What had Emma done? Was she working with those men? Had she let them in? I waited in the living room that night, my mind racing as I clutched the notebook in my hands. When Emma came home, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She froze in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the notebook in my hand. "What's that?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "This," I said, holding it up, "is your little book of secrets." Emma's expression darkened. For a moment she said nothing, her eyes darting toward the front door as if calculating whether she could make a quick escape. "You've been keeping track of us," I continued, my voice shaking with both fear and anger. You knew about those men, didn't you? You let them in." Her silence was deafening, and in that moment, I knew I was right. Emma wasn't just some innocent roommate who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been involved. But why? What was she after? "I didn't have a choice," she finally said, her voice low and cold. "You don't understand. This is bigger than you think." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about?" She took a step forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "They're not just burglars. They're part of something bigger. Something that controls people, controls everything. I was supposed to help them keep an eye on you and Nicole, but I didn't know they would take it this far." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. "You betrayed us," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Why?" "I needed the money," she said, her tone bitter. "I didn't think it would get this bad, but now it's too late." The room seemed to close in around me as I realized the full extent of what had happened. Emma had let those men into our lives, allowed them to terrorize us for money, and now she was trapped in something far more dangerous than she had bargained for. Before I could react, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. Nicole came rushing out, her face pale and terrified. "What's going on?" she demanded, her eyes darting between me and Emma. Emma's face twisted with fear and desperation. "They're coming back," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "They're coming for both of you." Panic set in. I could see it in Nicole's eyes, and I felt it coursing through my veins. We were in danger, real danger, and Emma, the person we had trusted, had been a part of it all along. The front door suddenly rattled, the sound of footsteps just outside. My heart raced. They were back. They had come to finish what they started. Without thinking, I grabbed Nicole's hand and bolted for the back door. We sprinted through the dark alley, the cold air biting at our skin as we ran as fast as we could. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew one thing for sure. We had to get as far away from that house, from Emma, as possible. We didn't stop running until we reached the end of the block, gasping for breath, our hearts racing. Behind us, the house stood silent, dark, like a shadow waiting to swallow us whole. We couldn't go back. Nicole looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "What the hell was that about?" I shook my head, still trying to process everything. "Emma, she's part of something bad, really bad. Those men, they weren't just robbers, they were after something, and she was helping them." Nicole stared at me in disbelief. "What? Why?" "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling, "but we can't go back there. Not ever." As we stood there, catching our breath, the cold night air swirling around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The men would be back. Emma had made a deal with them, and now we were caught in the middle. And somewhere, in the darkness of that house, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. But for now, all we could do was run, and hope that we weren't already too late. I'll never forget that night on the North Pacific. It's not the kind of thing you can forget, even if you try to. The ocean, it has a way of making you feel small, but on that night, it wasn't just small. I felt like I was nothing. We'd been out fishing for days, the crew and I, pushing the limits like we always did. The forecasts warned of a storm, but we thought we could handle it. Hell, we'd been through worse, or at least, we thought we had. The thing about the sea is, you get cocky, and it humbles you real quick. We were about 50 miles off the Alaskan coast when the wind picked up. It started as a whisper, whistling through the rigging, but before long, it turned into a howling beast. The swells were growing by the minute, towering walls of black water that seemed to rise out of nowhere. I was on deck trying to help secure the gear when I saw the sky. It wasn't right. Clouds moved in fast, but they didn't swirl or roll like you'd expect. They just appeared. One minute, a sliver of moonlight, the next, nothing but an inky blackness. That's when I knew we were in for it. The first wave hit hard, slamming against the side of the boat. Water rushed over the rails, drenching us, and I could hear the groan of the hull as the boat strained to keep itself together. The captain shouted orders, but the wind stole his words, and we were left scrambling. Each of us knew what needed to be done without needing to hear it. We had to batten down, ride out the storm, and pray we didn't go under. But the sea had other plans. A second wave hit, larger than the first, and the boat listed sharply to starboard. I grabbed the railing, my knuckles turning white as I held on for dear life. The roar of the wind and waves was deafening, like the whole ocean had risen against us. I caught sight of the captain, his face pale beneath his soaked beard, and that's when I knew we weren't making it through. The wave that flipped the boat came from behind. I didn't see it, but I felt it, the way the whole vessel lifted beneath my feet, like a toy in the hands of some cruel child. There was a moment, a split second where time seemed to freeze, and everything was weightless. Then the world turned upside down. The boat capsized, throwing us into the water like rag dolls. The cold hit me first, a bone-deep, soul-crushing cold that steals the breath from your lungs. The North Pacific doesn't mess around. It's not like falling into a lake or even the Atlantic. It's a cold that feels alive, like it's reaching into you, clawing at your insides. I went under, sinking fast. My life vest, thank God for the life vest, it jerked me back to the surface. But by then the boat was gone, swallowed by the sea. The crew, I couldn't see them. I couldn't see anything, really. Just black water all around, rising and falling with the waves. The wind whipped across the surface, driving freezing rain into my face, and I gasped for air, only to get a mouthful of salt water. Every instinct in me screamed to swim, to fight, but the ocean, it doesn't care. It just drags you along like a piece of driftwood. I don't know how long I fought the waves. Minutes, hours. Time doesn't mean much when you're out there. The only thing that matters is staying afloat. My arms ached, my legs burned, and my mind, well, that was where the real horror started. You see, it wasn't just the storm. No, something else was out there. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The kind of fear that creeps up when you're alone, facing death in the middle of nowhere. But then I saw it. A light. At first it was small, just a faint glow off in the distance. It didn't look like a ship's light, too still for that. Ships bob and sway, their lights flickering with the motion of the waves. But this light, it was different. It stayed in one place, unmoving, no matter how the ocean churned. I tried to convince myself it was land, maybe a lighthouse, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. We were too far out. There shouldn't have been anything for miles. Yet there it was, a strange, unblinking glow. It wasn't comforting. No, it filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. Something about that light, it didn't belong. The wind howled and the waves slapped at me, pulling me closer to it. My life vest kept me afloat, but I wasn't swimming anymore. The current was doing the work, dragging me toward that eerie glow. Every instinct I had told me to turn away, to fight the pull, but the ocean, it doesn't give you choices. As I got closer, I noticed something even stranger. The water around the light, it was calm, dead calm. The waves, which had been battering me moments before, seemed to vanish as I neared it. It was like the storm didn't exist in that small patch of ocean, like some invisible wall was holding it at bay. The light sat in the center of it, still and unwavering. I stopped kicking. Fear locked me in place, even as the current dragged me closer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing fit. That light, it shouldn't have been there. And the calm water, it was impossible. Everything about it was wrong. That's when I heard it, a sound beneath the waves. Not the usual groan and crash of the ocean, but something else. A deep, resonant hum, almost like a voice. It was low at first, barely audible over the wind, but as I drifted closer, it grew louder, vibrating through the water, through me. I panicked. I tried to turn, to swim away, but my limbs were heavy, and the current was too strong. That hum, it was inside my head now, buzzing in my skull, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I was close now, too close to the light, and I could see it wasn't just a glow. There was something beneath it. In the murky depths, just below the surface, I saw it. A shape, large, unmoving, but undeniably there. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let it pull me under. I kicked with all the strength I had left, but it wasn't enough. The current was relentless, dragging me closer and closer to the light, to that thing lurking below it. My mind screamed, my body ached, and just when I thought I'd be lost to it forever, a hand grabbed me. One of the crew. I didn't know how he found me in that mess, but he had me, pulling me back, away from the light. Together we fought the current, kicking and thrashing until the waves took hold of us again, carrying us out of that calm, unnatural patch of water. We drifted for hours after that, clinging to wreckage, shivering and silent. Neither of us spoke about the light. I don't know if he saw it, and I wasn't about to ask. There are some things you don't want to know the answer to. The rescue came at dawn. A Coast Guard helicopter spotted us and hauled us out of the water. We were the only ones they found. The rest of the crew, they were gone. Lost to the storm, or maybe something worse. I've been back to the sea since then, but I never go that far north. I can't. Every time I think about it, I see that light, hear that hum in my head, and I know that whatever it was out there, it's still waiting, it's still there, and I'll never be free of it. Even now, sitting here, far away from the water, I can feel it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. You think time would dull the memory, that the terror would fade with distance, but it doesn't. The sea has a way of sinking into you, deeper than you realize. I tried to move on after the rescue, tried to go back to life as usual, but nothing was the same. The nightmares came first. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that storm, back in the freezing water, drifting closer to that light. In the dreams, though, it was worse. In the dreams, the light didn't just pull me toward it, it called to me. It's hard to explain. It wasn't a voice, not in the way you'd think of a voice. It was more like a sensation, a tug deep inside, something primal, something ancient. It didn't speak in words, but I understood it all the same. It wanted me. It wanted all of us. And in the dream, I always went to it. No matter how hard I fought, no matter how much I screamed or thrashed, the light always won. I'd slip beneath the surface, sinking into that calm, unnatural water. And just before everything went dark, I'd see it. The shape. Larger than I remembered, more defined, like it was coming into focus. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, the feeling of cold water still clinging to my skin. It wasn't just the nightmares, though. That would have been enough, sure, but something worse followed. Something that made me question my sanity, my very grip on reality. It started small, little things, like hearing the faint hum of that sound again, even when I was nowhere near the ocean. I'd be in my kitchen, fixing coffee, and out of nowhere, there it was, that deep, resonant buzz, vibrating in my bones. It would last only a second or two, just long enough for me to doubt if I'd heard it at all. But it kept happening, more and more frequently, until it wasn't just at home. I heard it at work, in the grocery store, even when I was driving. That same deep hum, always in the back of my mind, always pulling at me, like it was trying to drag me back to the sea. But that wasn't the worst of it. No, the worst came when I started seeing things. At first, it was flashes, just quick glimpses out of the corner of my eye. I'd be walking down the street, and suddenly, I'd see the light. Not glowing like it did in the water, but a reflection in a window or a flicker in a streetlight. And every time it would be there, waiting for me to notice. Then one night, I saw it for real. I was at the docks. Don't ask me why I went back. Maybe I thought I could find some closure, some way to face what happened. But as I stood there, staring out over the water, I saw it. That light, far out on the horizon, glowing steadily in the dark. It wasn't a boat or a buoy. I know those lights, and this was different. It was the same light from that night, the same, unwavering glow that defied everything I knew about the sea. I froze, unable to look away, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought about getting in a boat, going out there to see if it was real. But deep down, I knew. I didn't need to get closer to know what it was. And I didn't need to hear the hum to know that it was calling me again. I turned and walked away. I didn't run, though every part of me wanted to. I just walked, slow and steady, trying to ignore the pull, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I could feel it. The pull, the same one I'd felt in the water, tugging at my insides, begging me to come back. After that, things got worse. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the light to appear again. Every sound I heard felt like that hum. Every reflection felt like a glimpse of that glow. My friends noticed, of course. They tried to help, but how do you explain something like this to someone who wasn't there? Who didn't see what I saw? Who didn't feel it? I tried talking to a therapist, but it didn't go well. She listened, nodded in all the right places, but by the end of the session, I could see it in her eyes. She thought I was crazy. Hell, maybe I am. Maybe it's all in my head. But there's a part of me, a part that I can't ignore. that knows better. I've stayed away from the ocean since then, moved inland, far from any coastlines, just to be safe. But the thing is, it doesn't matter. The light, whatever it is, it doesn't care where I am. I still see it sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, flickering in the distance. And every time I hear that hum, that low, resonant buzz, I know it's waiting. It's waiting for me to slip up, to give in, to answer its call. And here's the thing, I know one day I will. I can feel it getting stronger, pulling harder. Every day it gets a little closer, like the light is creeping toward me, even here, hundreds of miles from the water. I used to think I could outrun it, that if I stayed away from the sea, I'd be safe. But now I know better. There's no escaping it. Not really. Maybe it's just a matter of time. Maybe whatever it is out there doesn't care how far I run or how long I fight. Maybe it's just waiting for me to get tired, to give up. But here's the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night. Sometimes when I lie awake, staring at the darkness, I want to go back. I want to see that light again, to feel the calm in the middle of the storm, to hear the hum grow louder. Maybe it's the madness talking, or maybe it's something else. Maybe the light was never meant to hurt me. Maybe it's calling me for a reason. But then I remember the shape in the water, the thing lurking just beneath the surface, and I know the truth. The light isn't a beacon, it's a trap. And whatever's waiting out there in the dark, it's patient. It's been waiting for me all this time. And one day soon, I think it's going to get me. When it does, no one will know. They'll say I lost my mind, that I went mad from the trauma. They'll write it off as another poor soul lost to the sea. But that won't be the truth. Not the whole truth anyway. The sea took part of me that night, a part I'll never get back. And when it finally takes the rest of me, well, I don't think anyone will ever know what really happened. But you know. And now that I've told you, maybe you'll understand. Maybe you'll believe me. Just promise me one thing. If you ever see that light, if you ever hear that hum, don't go near it. Don't even look at it. Turn around and walk the other way, no matter how much it pulls at you. Because once you've seen it, once you've felt it, you'll never be free. You ever have one of those feelings, like something's wrong before anything even happens? Like you get this chill in your bones, this uneasy feeling you can't shake, even though everything around you seems fine? That's how I felt when my family decided to go camping last summer. It was supposed to be a fun trip, you know? A break from everything, work, school, life. My dad had found this campsite deep in the woods, far away from the usual crowded spots, and he was excited to get out there with me and my younger sister Megan. At first I was all for it. I mean, we'd been camping before and it had always been a good time. But then, a few nights before the trip, I watched this movie, a horror film of course, about this deer. Sounds ridiculous, right? A deer. But in the movie, this thing wasn't just any deer. It had these weird, almost human-like eyes, and the way it would just stand there, watching the characters in the film without moving, without blinking, it freaked me out more than I want to admit. Even after the movie was over, that image stuck with me. Those eyes just staring. So when we finally headed out for the trip, that feeling of unease I'd been carrying didn't go away. The drive took us deeper into the woods than I'd expected. We left the main roads behind, turning onto dirt paths that seemed barely wide enough for the car. The trees around us were thick, casting long shadows that flickered across the car as we passed. Megan was sitting next to me in the back seat, her face glued to her phone, oblivious to everything outside. My dad, of course, was humming to some old rock tune, excited about the adventure. But me, I couldn't help but feel like those woods were closing in around us. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping low, casting an orange glow across the treetops. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just this heavy stillness that seemed unnatural. My dad got out of the car, stretching and breathing in the air like it was the freshest thing he'd ever tasted. "Perfect spot, huh?" he said, smiling over at me. I tried to smile back, but something about the place just felt wrong. I brushed it off, though, thinking I was still spooked from the stupid movie. We set up camp pretty quickly. 2 tents, one for me and Megan, one for my parents. The fire was going, dinner was cooking, and for a while, things felt almost normal. The woods around us seemed a little less menacing in the firelight. Megan was in a good mood too, chatting about some YouTube drama, completely unaware of my growing discomfort. But then, as the light faded and the shadows around our camp grew longer, that feeling came back, stronger this time. I kept catching myself looking out into the trees, half expecting to see something there, something watching. My dad noticed, of course, because he's always been good at picking up on stuff like that. "You all right, kid?" he asked, leaning back in his camping chair, a beer in his hand. "Yeah," I lied, trying to shake off the tension. "Just tired, I guess." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He let it go, though, and after dinner, we all sat around the fire for a bit before turning in for the night. That's when things really started to go south. Megan and I crawled into our tent, zipped up our sleeping bags, and she fell asleep almost instantly. I, on the other hand, couldn't relax. I kept hearing things, small, barely noticeable sounds coming from the woods. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, like something was moving out there, just beyond the light of the dying fire. I kept telling myself it was probably a raccoon or maybe a deer, but that did little to calm me down. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those human-like eyes from the movie, staring at me from the darkness. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was dark, really dark. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting only the faintest glow. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. But what woke me up wasn't the cold. It was the silence. There was nothing. No wind, no animals, not even the usual creaking of trees, just this dead, heavy silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I lay there, frozen, listening, and then I heard it, a soft rustling, not far from the tent. I turned my head slowly, heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the trees, but it wasn't like an animal moving through the brush. It was deliberate, like something was pushing its way through the undergrowth, trying to stay quiet but not quite managing. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the noise. Then I saw it. Through the thin mesh of the tent, silhouetted against the faint glow of the fire, was a shape. At first I thought it was a tree or maybe a branch swaying in the breeze, but then it moved, slowly, gracefully. A tall, slender figure, stepping between the trees, its movements almost unnatural. It took a step closer, and that's when I saw them, the eyes. They were reflective, catching the faint light of the embers, but they weren't like animal eyes. They were too large, too human. My blood ran cold. It was a deer, or at least it looked like one. But something was wrong with it. Its body was twisted in a way that didn't seem possible. Its neck too long, its legs too thin, and those eyes, they were locked onto the tent. Watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to wake Megan, to get my parents, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed by fear as the thing stared at us. It didn't move for what felt like an eternity, just stood there half hidden in the trees, watching. And then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling. I didn't know what I'd just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't sleeping that night. Hours passed and the night dragged on. I kept listening for any sign of the thing, but the woods had gone silent again. It wasn't until the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn that I started to relax just a little. I told myself that whatever it was gone. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd just let that stupid movie get to me. But then, just as I was starting to drift off again, the tent ripped open. I didn't have time to react before something grabbed me, yanking me out of the tent with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I hit the ground hard, my head spinning, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything, just darkness and cold air. When I finally managed to focus, I saw it again. The deer, or whatever it was, loomed over me, its body hunched and contorted, its face inches from mine. Those eyes, God, those eyes, stared down at me with this eerie intelligence, like it knew exactly what it was doing. Its breath was hot and rancid, and the sound it made, it wasn't a growl or a snarl, but this horrible guttural noise. A cross between a human scream and an animal's cry. I kicked, thrashed, tried to get away, but its grip was like iron. It dragged me through the dirt, pulling me toward the trees, and I could feel the ground tearing at my skin, my legs kicking helplessly. Then I felt it, a sharp, searing pain in my leg. I screamed, the pain blinding, and I kicked harder, desperate to break free. Somehow, I managed to land a solid hit on the thing's side, and it let out this horrible screeching sound before releasing me. I scrambled back, half crawling, half limping toward the camp. By the time I made it to my parents' tent, I was sobbing, barely able to stand. My leg was a mess. Blood soaked through my pants, and I could barely feel anything below the knee. I don't remember much after that, just my dad's panicked voice, my mom's screams, and the distant sound of sirens as they rushed me to the hospital. When I woke up, the doctors told me I'd lost my leg from the knee down. They said it looked like an animal attack, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But I know the truth. It wasn't an animal. It was still out there, watching, waiting. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That thing, it wasn't done with me. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear it, the sound of its footsteps in the distance, the rustling of leaves just outside my window. After the attack, life was never the same. You'd think losing a leg would be the worst part, right? I mean, physically, it was devastating. The pain, the recovery, learning to move around with a prosthetic, that was all brutal, sure. But what really haunted me was what I knew was still out there. Something that didn't make sense, something that shouldn't exist. And yet, it had attacked me, pulled me out of that tent, stared into my eyes with something far too intelligent for a wild animal. For months after, I tried convincing myself it was some twisted nightmare, my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had dragged me into those woods wasn't just an animal, it was something else, something worse. The rest of the family tried to cope in their own way. My parents, especially my dad, had this unshakable belief that I'd been attacked by a mountain lion. They said the doctors were sure of it, that it was the only logical explanation. Every time I brought up the creature I saw, the thing with human-like eyes, my dad would get this tight look on his face, like he was trying to force himself to believe me, but couldn't quite manage it. My mom wouldn't even talk about it. She refused to acknowledge anything beyond, "It was a freak accident, and we're lucky you're alive." Megan, though, she knew. She never said it out loud, but I could see it in her eyes. Every time she looked at me, I could tell she believed me. And worse, I could tell she was just as scared as I was. She'd stopped sleeping with her windows open, even though it was her favorite thing to do when we were younger. She stopped going outside alone, even in broad daylight. It was like she felt it too, that we weren't safe, even at home. The nightmares came next. Every night I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as the memory of those eyes, that inhuman scream, played over and over in my head. I'd dream of the creature, standing in the shadows of the trees, watching, waiting. And sometimes in those dreams, I wouldn't wake up in time. I'd feel its grip on me again, pulling me deeper into the forest, into some dark, unknown place, where the cold seemed to seep into my bones. After a few months, the nightmares started bleeding into real life. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard something outside, footsteps, branches cracking, leaves rustling. But when I looked, there was nothing. I tried telling myself it was just the wind, the neighborhood dogs, anything rational, but that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The worst part was the whispers. It started slow, barely noticeable at first. I'd be sitting in my room, trying to distract myself with a book or some show, when I'd hear it, just the faintest sound, like a voice in the distance, too quiet to make out the words. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, a lingering effect of the trauma, but it kept happening. Sometimes I'd hear it in broad daylight, when I was walking with Megan or sitting at the dinner table. A soft, low murmur, like someone was talking just out of earshot, watching me from the edges of my world. I tried to ignore it. I really did, but it became impossible when it started getting louder. One night, about 6 months after the attack, I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, when I heard it again, the whispering. Only this time, it wasn't coming from far away. It was close, in my room. I froze, barely breathing, as I strained to listen. It was clearer now, like it was coming from right behind me. At first it sounded like gibberish, like a low, distorted hum. But then, slowly, the words started to form. "Come, back." My blood ran cold. I sat up, heart pounding. my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. But there was nothing, just shadows and silence. I tried telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the whisper came again, louder this time, and more distinct. "Come back to us." I stumbled out of bed, grabbing my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I turned on every light in the room, trying to banish the darkness, but the feeling didn't go away. The air was thick, suffocating, like something was pressing down on me. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, I started to feel like I was going crazy. The whispering followed me everywhere, at home, at school, even when I was with my friends. I stopped going out as much, afraid that I'd hear it again, that it would be louder, clearer, maybe even closer. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew that whatever had attacked me in those woods hadn't let me go. It was still there somewhere, watching. Then came the final sign. It was a Saturday, and Megan and I were home alone. My parents had gone out for the day, so we were just hanging out, watching TV. The house was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in a while, I felt like maybe I was starting to move past everything. But then I noticed Megan. She was sitting on the couch, staring out the window. At first I thought she was just daydreaming, but then I saw it. The look on her face. That same wide-eyed expression of fear I'd seen the night I was attacked. Her skin had gone pale, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Megan," I asked, my voice coming out shaky. She didn't respond, just kept staring. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, right where the forest began, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and unnaturally still. At first I thought it was just a person, maybe a hiker, but then I saw its eyes, reflective, glowing in the dim light, human-like eyes. My stomach dropped. It was the same creature, the same thing that had attacked me. "Megan, get away from the window," I whispered, my heart racing. But she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the thing, her face pale with fear. Then, without warning, the creature moved. Slowly, almost gracefully, it took a step toward the house. And that's when I heard it again, the whisper, but now it was loud, clear, and unmistakable. "Come back to us." I grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her away from the window, and slammed the curtains shut. My heart was pounding in my ears as I dragged her into the hallway, my mind racing. "We need to go," I muttered, grabbing my keys, my hands shaking. Megan finally snapped out of her trance. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't stay there, not with that thing outside. We bolted out the back door, running to the car, my mind a blur of panic and fear. I started the engine, my hands still trembling, and we sped out of there, leaving the house and that thing behind. We drove in silence, the tension thick in the air. Megan was still in shock, and honestly, so was I. We didn't stop driving until we were back in the city, the streetlights finally giving me some sense of safety. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but deep down, I know it's not. That thing, whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting, and the worst part, I know it won't stop until it gets what it wants. Because every night when the wind picks up and the house is quiet, I still hear it. Come back to us." I never expected a normal day at work to turn into the kind of nightmare you only hear about in crime thrillers. But it happened. And now, every time I walk through the woods, every time the wind rustles through the trees, I get this feeling deep in my gut. That cold, creeping fear, like something's waiting just beyond the next ridge. I've been a park ranger for nearly 5 years. In those 5 years, I've seen all sorts of strange things in the forest, bizarre wildlife behavior, people getting lost for days, even the occasional campfire gone wrong. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day. It started out like any other afternoon. My shift was winding down, and I was doing one final patrol along the trail that runs deep into the northern woods. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. That late afternoon light, it always makes the forest feel more alive somehow, like it's watching you. There was a chill in the air, typical for autumn, and the scent of damp earth filled my lungs. I liked this time of day. It was peaceful, quiet, at least it was supposed to be. I was about 3 miles in when I heard it, The faint hum of voices carried on the wind. At first, I didn't think much of it. There were always campers or hikers around. But something about the tone made me pause. It wasn't the kind of casual chatter you'd hear on a hiking trip. These voices were hushed, urgent, like they didn't want to be overheard. Curiosity got the better of me. I veered off the trail, moving quietly through the underbrush, trying to pinpoint where the voices were coming from. As I got closer, the air seemed to thicken with tension. I crept behind a cluster of thick pines and crouched down, peering through the branches. That's when I saw them. 4 men, standing in a small clearing, surrounding a large wooden crate. The box was partially open, and from my angle, I could see the glint of metal inside. Guns. A lot of guns. Automatic rifles, shotguns, handguns. More firepower than anyone should ever need. My heart jumped into my throat. They were talking in low voices, one of them checking something on a tablet, the others unloading the weapons. It wasn't just a group of hunters or survivalists. This was something else entirely, something darker. The way they moved, the tension in their postures, it screamed of danger. I knew right then that I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, get the hell out of there as fast as I could. But I hesitated. I'm a ranger. It's my job to report things like this. Illegal hunting, poaching, and well, now apparently arms smuggling. I needed proof, something to show the authorities. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my phone, trying to snap a picture from where I crouched. That's when I stepped on a twig. It was so quiet at first that I thought they didn't hear it. But then, one of the men, a tall, muscular guy with a shaved head, looked up. His eyes locked onto where I was hiding. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. The others turned immediately, following his gaze. I didn't wait for them to come any closer. I bolted. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, crashing through the trees, the sound of their footsteps pounding behind me. I could hear them yelling, barking orders at each other. My lungs burned as I sprinted through the forest, my mind racing. I didn't know the terrain as well off the trail, and I was running blind, barely able to focus on where I was going. I dodged branches, leapt over fallen logs, but they were fast, too fast. I could hear them getting closer, the snapping of twigs and underbrush as they closed in on me. My legs were screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. Stopping wasn't an option. Then, without warning, a gunshot rang out. The sharp crack echoed through the trees, and I felt a hot, searing pain tear through my side. I stumbled, the world tilting as my legs gave out beneath me. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. Blood soaked through my shirt, warm and sticky. I tried to move, to crawl away, but my vision was blurring, and my strength was fading fast. I heard footsteps approach, slow, deliberate. They were close now. I could hear their voices, talking in low, angry tones, but my head was spinning too much to make out what they were saying. The pain in my side was unbearable, radiating through my body with every shallow breath. I was going to die out there, I realized. In the middle of the woods, alone, bleeding out while these men stood over me like predators circling a wounded animal. But then something happened. A noise, a different noise, came from deeper in the forest. Footsteps, rustling leaves, and laughter? It was faint, but unmistakable. A group of people, probably a camping party, completely unaware of what was happening nearby. The men must have heard it too, because suddenly they stopped talking. I could see their silhouettes through the haze of my vision, turning toward the sound. One of them cursed under his breath. "We've got company," one of them muttered. The leader, the one with the shaved head, glanced down at me. "Deal with him," he ordered one of the others, jerking his chin in my direction. "I'll take care of the campers." My heart sank as I watched the man pull out a handgun, his expression cold and detached. He walked toward me slowly, taking his time, like he enjoyed drawing it out. I tried to crawl away, my hands clawing at the dirt, but I was too weak. And then, just as he raised the gun, there was a shout. A young woman's voice, loud and full of shock. "Hey, what are you doing?" I looked up through blurry eyes and saw them. The campers. There were 4 of them, probably college kids, standing on the edge of the clearing, frozen in place as they realized what they'd just walked into. For a split second, everything was still. And then chaos erupted. The gunman whipped around to face the campers, firing a warning shot into the air. They screamed and scattered, running in different directions as panic took over. The man with the shaved head shouted orders, barking at his men to round them up. But in the chaos, they forgot about me. I don't know how, but I managed to push myself up, gritting my teeth against the pain. My side was on fire, and every movement felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. But I couldn't just lie there. I wasn't going to die. Not like this. I staggered to my feet, using a tree for support, and started limping toward the campers. They didn't know what they were up against. They were scared, unarmed, and completely out of their depth. But I had to help them, somehow. The woods were a maze of shadows and flickering light as the sun dipped lower. The sound of the men chasing the campers echoed through the trees. Yells, gunshots, the rustling of leaves as they ran for their lives. I could hear the campers shouting to each other, trying to regroup, but it was chaos. I forced myself to keep moving, every step a battle against the pain. I had to find them before the gunmen did. I caught up to them in a small ravine, hidden behind a cluster of boulders. They were huddled together, breathing hard, their faces pale with fear. One of the girls, a brunette with tear-streaked cheeks, was trying to stifle her sobs. Another guy, tall and wiry, kept glancing over his shoulder, like he expected the gunman to appear any second. They didn't see me at first, but when they did, the guy jumped to his feet, fists raised like he was ready to fight. "Whoa, whoa!" I rasped, holding up my hands. "I'm not with them. I'm a ranger. I'm hurt." They stared at me, wide-eyed, unsure whether to trust me. I couldn't blame them. I probably looked like hell, bloodied, limping, barely able to stand, but I didn't have time to convince them. "They're armed," I gasped, leaning against the boulder for support. "You need to stay low. They'll kill you if they find you." The guy's face hardened. "We can't just sit here." "We won't," I said, wincing as another wave of pain shot through me. "But we need a plan." For the next few minutes, we came up with a desperate plan. I showed them a nearby ranger station on my map, a small isolated outpost stocked with emergency supplies, including a radio that could contact authorities. It wasn't far, but the gunmen were still out there searching. We'd have to move fast and quietly. The woods were eerily silent as we made our way toward the station, every sound amplified in the stillness. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, could hear every crack of a branch beneath our feet, every rustle of leaves. The campers stuck close together, their faces tense with fear, but determined. I led the way, despite the searing pain in my side. My head was swimming, and the world kept tilting in and out of focus, but I pushed forward. I had no choice. If we didn't reach that station, none of us would make it out alive. The tall guy, his name was Adam, I think, stayed close to me, his eyes constantly scanning the trees, like he was ready to fight if we got cornered. The others, Maya, a brunette with tear-streaked cheeks, Dylan, a stocky guy with glasses, and Sarah, the smallest of the group, followed behind, whispering nervously to each other. The sound of footsteps and angry voices echoed through the woods behind us. They weren't far, and we knew it. The men were hunting us, and I had no doubt that they intended to silence us permanently. Every few minutes, we heard the crack of a gunshot, each one closer than the last. We were almost halfway to the station when everything went wrong. The air was cold, damp with the weight of the coming night. As we made our way down a narrow slope, trying to stay as quiet as possible, a voice shouted from behind us. "There they are!" Panic exploded in the group. I whipped around just in time to see one of the gunmen charging through the trees, his weapon raised. I grabbed Adam's arm and yanked him to the side, diving behind a fallen log just as a shot rang out. The bullet splintered the tree next to us, spraying bark into the air. "Run!" I shouted, trying to get the others moving, but they were frozen, too shocked to react. Before I could yell again, another figure appeared from the shadows. It was the leader, the man with the shaved head. He raised his hand, and everything went still. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he called out, his voice cold and commanding. I stood up slowly, my hands raised. The campers did the same, their faces pale with terror. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered. There was no way we could outrun them now. The leader's eyes locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have come back, Ranger. You should have stayed down when you had the chance." I swallowed hard, trying to think of something, anything, that could get us out of this. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice shaking but steady. You let us go, and we won't say a word. No one has to die here. He chuckled, a deep, humorless sound. Oh, but people already have, he said, his eyes darkening, and now you've seen too much. Before I could react, one of the men grabbed Maya, yanking her away from the group. She screamed, struggling against him, but he held her tight, dragging her toward the leader. No, Sarah cried, taking a step forward, but Adam grabbed her, pulling her back. The leader tilted his head, watching me with a sick smile. Here's the deal, Ranger. You come with us, nice and easy, and maybe I'll let the kids go. Maybe. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My mind raced. If I went with them, there was no way I was coming out of this alive. But I couldn't let them hurt the campers. They didn't deserve this. I clenched my fists, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Let them go first, I demanded, my voice tight. Then I'll come with you. The leader's smile widened. You're not in a position to negotiate. And then, just as he took a step toward me, everything changed.